I was startled awake by the piercing ring of my phone, my heart racing wildly. It wasn't just the early hour that alarmed me, it was the gut instinct that something was seriously wrong. Still half asleep, I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, my eyes bleary and unfocused. The name flashing on the screen hit me like a punch. Oliver. Oliver. What could he possibly want at this hour? Hello? My voice came out thick and bewildered. Sophia. The pause that followed felt unnervingly long. I need to see you. Can we meet? It's urgent. His tone, typically calm and reassuring, now carried a note of desperation. I sat up straighter, fully awake, my mind racing to grasp why he sounded so frantic. What's going on? Did something happen? My thoughts spiraled, leaping to countless alarming conclusions, none of which were good. Please, just meet me at the cabin. I'll explain everything when you get there. Before I could press him for more information, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, a flurry of questions buzzing in my mind. The cabin. Our family retreat in the countryside, where my husband and I often escaped when the chaos of city life became too much. But why would Oliver want to meet there? What could be so pressing that he couldn't wait for me to get more details? The air in my bedroom suddenly felt thick and suffocating. Throwing off the covers, I sprang into action, instinctively reaching for my clothes. My thoughts churned, struggling to make sense of the situation, but everything felt jumbled. Was it something to do with my daughter? Or issues in their marriage? I didn't know, but I had an unsettling feeling that nothing would ever be the same after today. In less than 20 minutes, I was on the road, the early morning fog casting an eerie light over the landscape as I drove toward the cabin. When I finally arrived, the low-hanging clouds made the familiar surroundings seem strange and foreboding. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires echoed in the stillness as I parked. My heart raced, and I clutched the steering wheel tightly, trying to calm my breath before stepping out. The cabin, which usually felt like a sanctuary, now loomed like a place of unease. I noticed Oliver's car already parked haphazardly, as though he had rushed to get here. My stomach tightened. He hadn't even known I was coming. Yet, somehow, he must have expected me. The front door was slightly ajar, a small detail that raised alarm bells in my mind. Something was off. I pushed the door open cautiously, the familiar creak of the old hinges heightening my anxiety. The cabin was silent, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. There stood Oliver by the kitchen window, gazing out into the woods. The tension radiating from his shoulders was palpable, even from a distance. Oliver. My voice barely pierced the silence, but it was enough to break his concentration. He turned to face me, and the expression on his face sent a chill down my spine. The usual self-assuredness was absent, replaced by something raw and vulnerable, something I hadn't seen in him before. Sophia. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been rehearsing this moment in his head, but the right words had eluded him. I was at a loss for what he meant. He gestured vaguely, and I still couldn't grasp what he was trying to say. Swallowing hard, I took a step closer. What's going on? He looked at me, then away, his eyes filled with guilt and uncertainty. I don't know how to say this. His words hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken meaning yet frustratingly incomplete. I moved closer, desperate to decipher his expression, his body language, anything that might shed light on the growing tension between us. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a pressure cooker. What do you mean, Oliver? This doesn't make sense. My voice came out sharper than I intended, fueled by confusion and anxiety. I needed clarity. He raked a hand through his hair, pacing a bit with his back turned to me. It's complicated, Sophia. I've kept this bottled up for so long, and I just can't hold it in anymore. I crossed my arms, bracing myself for what was to come, but an unsettling dread settled in my stomach. I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever revelation he was about to share. What could this possibly be about? My mind darted through various scenarios, trouble involving my daughter, a work-related issue, but none of those explanations felt right. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face me, his gaze locking onto mine with a seriousness that made me catch my breath. I don't know when it began, but I can't stop thinking about you. About us. I froze. Each word hit me like a tidal wave, crashing my thoughts together and leaving me unable to form a coherent response. About us? The phrase echoed in my mind, but it felt utterly surreal. This wasn't about my daughter or his marriage. It was something entirely different, something I wasn't prepared for. I know it's wrong, he blurted out, seemingly reading my mind. I know you're married, and so am I.
But it's been gnawing at me.
Sophia, I had to tell you. For a moment, it felt like the breath had been sucked from the room. I stared at Oliver, his words reverberating in my mind. Everything seemed distant, as if I were an observer watching this unfold from a great distance. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I possibly say? This was more than unexpected. It was unfathomable. Oliver looked at me, hope and fear mingling in his expression as he cautiously stepped closer, as if afraid I would flee. I know this sounds insane, he murmured, but I had to get this off my chest. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I took a step back, shaking my head as I struggled to process what he had just said. Oliver, this is real. I trailed off, unable to find the right words. This was utterly insane. He was my son-in-law, my daughter's husband. I should have felt a surge of anger, betrayal, or disgust. Instead, a strange, unsettling silence settled over my thoughts, as if a door had creaked open somewhere deep inside me, leaving me unsure whether to walk through it or slam it shut. I didn't mean to complicate things, he said gently. I just couldn't keep it hidden any longer. He reached out, his fingers grazing mine. Such a simple gesture, yet in that moment, everything shifted. His touch felt real, as did the tension hanging between us, an unspoken connection we had both ignored for what felt like ages. I pulled my hand back, taking another step away, but I could still feel the magnetic pull between us, that invisible line we had crossed without realizing. My heart raced, and a whirlwind of emotions clouded my mind, emotions I didn't want to label. I glanced away, desperate to break whatever spell had been cast, but it was too late. Sophia. His voice was barely a whisper, and when I looked back at him, I could see it in his eyes, the same feelings I was grappling with but refused to acknowledge. Something had undeniably shifted between us, and there was no turning back. He stepped closer again, and this time I didn't retreat. I couldn't. Before I could stop myself, before I could consider the consequences, Oliver leaned in. It wasn't hurried or overwhelming. It felt quiet and almost tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to stop him. But I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, and I froze, not in shock, but from an overwhelming wave of reality crashing down. There was nothing scripted or dramatic like you see in movies, just two people standing in the middle of a cabin, making a choice that couldn't be undone. The kiss was brief, almost tentative, but the weight of it lingered long after we parted. I pulled back, my breath unsteady, my mind racing to catch up. What had we just done? I should have felt guilt. I knew that much. But instead, I was struck by the gravity of what had transpired and the realization that this moment had been building for longer than either of us cared to admit. We shouldn't have. I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. But the words felt hollow, as if I didn't truly believe them. I know, Oliver replied softly. But we did. We stood in silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between us. I should have walked away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. There was something both terrifying and strangely comforting about how effortlessly our boundaries had blurred. I had no idea what would happen next, and perhaps that uncertainty was the scariest part. Oliver took a deep breath and stepped back, giving me some space, as if he understood the gravity of the decision I was grappling with. I'm not asking for anything, he said quietly. I just needed you to know how I feel. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and something else I couldn't quite name. I didn't know how to articulate my feelings or even what I should think. All I knew was that everything had irrevocably changed, and there was no way to rewind what had just occurred. I'll leave if you want, Oliver said, breaking the silence. If this was a mistake, I'll go. I'll never mention it again. I looked at him, trying to process the enormity of it all, but my mind was still trapped in that moment, the fleeting kiss that had upended everything. I need to think, I finally said, my voice trembling. Oliver nodded, understanding in his eyes, though disappointment was also evident. Take all the time you need, he replied softly. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The room felt colder in his absence, the weight of what had just happened settling around me like a dense fog. I stood there alone, unsure of my next move, acutely aware that whatever came after this wouldn't be straightforward. Nothing would ever be simple again. The following days passed in a blur. I tried to immerse myself in mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to distract from the gravity of that kiss. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of it lingered, surfacing when I least expected it. The cabin had transformed into a space filled with too many unspoken truths, and I wasn't sure I was ready to confront them. A week later, I found myself back at the cabin, pacing the kitchen with a cup of tea in hand. Early morning light filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the room. I had come here to clear my head and figure out my next steps, but instead, I felt more conflicted than ever. When I heard a car pull up outside, my heart sank. Oliver. I knew it before I even looked. I set my cup down and moved to the window, watching him step out of his car. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to come inside, but a part of me wanted to stay inside and avoid whatever conversation loomed ahead. Yet another part of me, one I was reluctant to acknowledge, was glad he had come. He knocked gently on the door and I opened it, the tension between us palpable. I didn't know if you'd be here, he said softly. I needed some time alone, I replied, though I wasn't sure that was entirely truthful. I stepped aside to let him in, fully aware that once I did, everything between us would come rushing back. We sat in the living room, a heavy silence stretching between us. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Oliver finally broke the quiet. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt that same pull, the same unspoken connection we had shared during our last encounter. I thought we agreed. I began, but my words faltered. We agreed to pretend it didn't happen. But it did, he insisted, leaning forward slightly. And now we can't just erase it. I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. There was no returning to how things had been. Something fundamental had shifted between us, and no amount of denial could change that. I don't know what to do, I admitted softly, vulnerability creeping in. It wasn't just about him or the kiss. It was everything that hung in the balance. My marriage, my entire life, the choices I never imagined I would have to face. Oliver reached out and placed his hand over mine. That simple touch sent a shockwave through me, just as it had before. I looked up at him, and the silence between us thickened. We were teetering on the edge of something perilous, fully aware of the danger. Without thinking, I leaned in, closing the gap between us. This kiss wasn't hurried or frantic. It was slow and heavy, filled with the weight of all the words we hadn't exchanged. When our lips met, everything else seemed to fade away, the doubts, the questions, the guilt. In that fleeting moment, it felt like it was just the two of us, suspended in a reality we couldn't escape. But when we finally pulled apart, the gravity of what we had just done settled heavily between us. This kiss was different from the first. It wasn't a hasty mistake or a moment of weakness. It was intentional and deliberate, and that frightened me more than I could admit. I shouldn't have done that, I murmured, but the words felt empty. We had crossed a line that was impossible to uncross. Oliver didn't respond right away, his gaze still fixed on mine. Finally, he spoke. Neither of us should have, but here we are. I nodded, unsure how to articulate my thoughts. The reality of our situation pressed down on me, and the room felt stiflingly small. I stood up abruptly, needing to create some distance. I need to think, I said, my voice sharper than I had intended. I don't know what this means, I added, and Oliver nodded in understanding. He didn't try to stop me or push for anything more than I was prepared to give. I'll leave you to it, he said softly, his voice steady. He walked to the door, and for a fleeting moment, I considered calling him back. Instead, I remained silent, watching him leave, the weight of the situation still lingering in the air. Once Oliver was gone, I sat in silence, feeling emptier than ever. I stared at the door long after he had left, my mind racing with everything that had just unfolded and the uncertain future that lay ahead. This wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about the boundary I had crossed and the choice I had made, or perhaps the choice I had been avoiding for too long. The tea I had brewed earlier was cold now, forgotten on the counter. I picked up the cup and poured its contents down the sink, performing the mundane action as a way to ground myself amidst the chaos swirling in my thoughts. Yet, no matter how I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was beginning to unravel. Days passed, and I stayed away from the cabin. I tried to return to my routine, working, socializing, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was that I was merely going through the motions. Every conversation with my husband felt forced, every shared moment tinged with guilt. I couldn't meet his eyes without feeling the crushing weight of my secret. Oliver hadn't reached out again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me was terrified of facing him, afraid of what another encounter would entail. But there was another part of me, the part one didn't want to confront, that missed him. I missed the connection, the electric tension that lingered between us. It was an inexplicable pull, and I had no idea how to break free from it. One afternoon, while I attempted to lose myself in a book, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my heart racing. It was a message from Oliver. "Can we talk?" Just 3 simple words, yet they unraveled the fragile calm I had tried to maintain over the past few days. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I stared at the message, my mind racing with questions. Could we talk? What more was there to say? Deep down, I knew that avoiding him wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that the pull between us didn't exist. Finally, I texted back. Not now, but soon. I need time. At least, that's what I told myself. As the days passed, the distance between Oliver and me only magnified the unspoken tension. My husband, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, continued his daily routines while I felt trapped in my own life. Each day served as a stark reminder of my choices and what I couldn't undo. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. The tension had reached a breaking point. It felt like something was going to snap. Oliver and I needed to confront what had happened, even if the answer was something neither of us wanted to face. I texted him again. Let's meet at the cabin. When I arrived, the cabin appeared exactly as it always had, but I was not the same. Inside, I felt a shift within me, a recognition that everything had irrevocably changed. Oliver was already there, sitting on the porch steps, waiting. He looked up when he heard my car approach, his expression inscrutable. I stepped out and walked toward him, that familiar uncertainty filling the air between us. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he said quietly as I drew closer. I nodded, crossing my arms over my chest. I wasn't entirely sure either. He stood up and gestured toward the door. "Do you want to go inside?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, let's stay out here." We settled onto the porch steps together, the silence stretching comfortably between us for the first time in a long while. I didn't feel the need to rush to fill the quiet with words. It felt oddly serene sitting there in the open air, the weight of the conversation looming just above us. After a long silence, I finally found my voice. "I don't know what this is, Oliver, or how we got here, but we can't keep going like this." He looked at me, calm yet cautious. "I never expected it to escalate like this," he admitted. "I didn't intend for any of this to unfold," I replied softly. "But it has." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the trees swaying in the breeze. "I don't want to hurt anyone, especially you." The simplicity of his statement struck me harder than I anticipated. We both knew we hadn't meant for things to spiral out of control, but good intentions didn't change the reality of our situation. "I have no idea how to fix this," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we can't, he responded, the honesty in his tone bringing both relief and a fresh wave of pain. We sat in silence for a while, each of us acutely aware that whatever choice we made next would alter everything. As we lingered on the porch, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The fading light gave everything a surreal quality, as if we were caught in a moment frozen in time, awaiting the inevitable. Oliver hadn't spoken for a while, and neither had I. We were both ensnared in a quiet filled with unasked questions, struggling to find answers. After what felt like hours, Oliver finally broke the silence. What are we going to do, Sophia? I can't keep pretending this didn't happen. I don't think either of us can. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. He was right. There was no pretending anymore. The kiss, the connection, the feelings, everything was real, and it had complicated my life beyond repair. It had shattered the fragile equilibrium I had worked so hard to maintain. I honestly don't know, I admitted as I opened my eyes to meet his gaze. I have no idea how to move forward from here. Oliver shifted in his seat, turning to face me more directly. His eyes searched mine, seeking something, clarity, perhaps, or reassurance. But I had nothing to give. We need to be honest with ourselves, Sophia, about what this really is. What do you mean? I asked, though deep down I already knew. We can't keep meeting like this, hoping it will just go away, he said, his voice gentle yet firm. We both know it won't. We need to make a decision. A decision. That was what it all came down to, and it terrified me. The choice I wanted to make, the one that felt right in the heat of the moment, wasn't the one I knew I should make. I glanced down at my hands, nervously fiddling with a loose thread on my sweater. My mind raced, caught between the life I had built and the feelings I was reluctant to confront. Oliver, I began, searching for the right words. I care about you. I really do. But this is dangerous for both of us. For our families. What happens if this gets out? What if we let this go too far? He sighed deeply, a conflicted expression crossing his face. I know I've considered that too, but I can't ignore what I feel. And I don't think you can either. He was right, and that made this all the more difficult. Ignoring my feelings had become impossible, yet the idea of risking everything for something so uncertain was equally daunting. The rational part of me knew what I should do. Walk away, safeguard the life I had constructed, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the other part of me, the one that had been drawn to Oliver from the start, wanted to stay. Do you honestly believe there's a way for this to end well? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, the silence between us growing heavier by the second. I don't know, he finally admitted. But I can't just walk away from this without knowing for certain. I can't walk away from you. My chest tightened at his words. There was a finality to them that made it clear that if I chose to stay, if I let this continue, it would only become harder to stop. Yet, the pull between us was undeniable, something that had been simmering beneath the surface from the beginning. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said quietly, especially not my husband. Oliver looked at me, his expression softening. Neither do I, but this is real, Sophia. Whatever this is, it's genuine and we need to understand what that means. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. Everything felt too tangled, too complicated. The thought of facing my husband and carrying this secret any longer made me feel nauseous. Yet the idea of letting Oliver go completely felt equally impossible. I can't make this decision right now, I confessed, my voice trembling slightly. I need more time. Oliver nodded, his gaze understanding. I'll give you as much time as you need. We sat there in silence for a while longer, neither of us speaking. The sun had fully set, leaving the yard in the soft embrace of twilight. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It was filled with all the unspoken words, all the emotions we were trying to navigate. After what felt like an eternity, Oliver stood up, breaking the stillness. I should go, he said softly, his voice heavy with unvoiced thoughts. I stood up too, though my legs felt shaky beneath me. Yeah, maybe that's for the best. We walked to the door together, the atmosphere still thick with the weight of everything unresolved. As he reached for the handle, Oliver turned to me one last time. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, I felt that same magnetic connection that had drawn us together in the first place. "I'll be waiting," he said quietly before stepping outside and closing the door behind him. As soon as he left, the house felt colder, emptier. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, questioning whether I had just made the right choice or the biggest mistake of my life. The next few days drifted by in a haze. I immersed myself in the daily grind, hoping that keeping busy would drown out the relentless thoughts swirling in my mind. Yet, no matter how much I tried to distract myself, Oliver's words, the intensity of our last conversation, clung to me like a stubborn shadow. I found myself glancing at my phone more often than I cared to admit, wondering if he would text me or if I should take the initiative. The silence between us, while necessary, felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. One evening, as the sun began to set, filtering warm golden light through the windows, I sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine. My husband was working late, and I welcomed the solitude, but the quiet only amplified the ache in my chest. Oliver's parting words echoed in my mind. "I'll be waiting." Waiting for what, exactly? For me to make a choice? For us to figure out how to navigate this complicated mess? The burden of it all felt suffocating, and I found myself questioning whether there was a way out. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. I grabbed it reflexively, my heart racing as I saw Oliver's name flash across the screen. "Can we meet one last time? I need to know where we stand." My pulse quickened as I absorbed his words. I had promised myself I wouldn't see him again until I had some clarity, but deep down, I knew I was still lost. I wasn't sure what I wanted, or maybe I was, but the fear of admitting it held me back. After a moment of hesitation, I typed back, "Okay, tomorrow at the cabin." The next day, as I drove toward the cabin, I felt the familiar knot of dread and anticipation in my stomach. The air had turned crisp, and the trees lining the road were shedding their leaves, making the world feel more exposed and vulnerable. I pulled into the gravel driveway, parking next to Oliver's car, which was already there. He waited for me on the porch steps, just like before. Stepping out of the car, my heart raced, and the atmosphere between us crackled with unspoken words. I walked over and sat beside him, neither of us saying a word at first. The silence was thick, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. We simply sat there, each of us waiting for the other to break the stillness. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Oliver said finally, his voice low and uncertain. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, glancing at him. "But here I am." He nodded, his gaze focused on his hands. "I've been thinking about everything about us." "Me too," I replied, my voice barely audible. We lingered in silence for a moment, the cool breeze brushing against our faces while the leaves rustled around us. I wanted to speak, to articulate the turmoil inside me, but the words wouldn't come. I had spent so much time rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain everything, yet now, sitting beside him, my thoughts were a tangled mess. "Sophia," Oliver began, his tone steady yet gentle. "I know this isn't easy for you.
It's not easy for me either.
But I need to know, is this real for you? Do you feel the same way I do?" My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. This was it, the moment I had been avoiding, the question I had dreaded facing. My heart raced, and my hands trembled. I wanted to give him a genuine answer, but doubt clouded my thoughts. "I don't know," I finally confessed, my voice breaking. "I don't know what's real anymore." Oliver's expression shifted, disappointment crossing his face, but he nodded as if he understood. "I get it. This is complicated, but I can't keep doing this without knowing where we stand." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he replied softly. "But I can't pretend this doesn't matter to me." Abruptly, I stood up, feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. I stepped away, desperate to clear my mind. I sensed Oliver rise behind me, but he didn't approach. We stood on the brink of something perilous, and we both knew it. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I can't just throw everything away, my marriage, my life." Oliver stepped toward me, his voice firm yet kind. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself. Honest with me?" Tears threatened to spill as I turned to face him. "I don't know how to be honest about something I don't fully grasp." He nodded, absorbing my struggle. We stood in silence, the wind swirling around us, leaves dancing at our feet. Just as I was about to speak again, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart sinking when I saw my husband's name on the screen. I hesitated, staring at it before finally answering. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Sophia, I know everything." Those 4 words hit me like a punch to the gut, freezing me in place. I could feel Oliver's eyes on me, watching for my reaction. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll explain when you get home," he replied, his tone cold and unyielding. "We need to talk." The line went dead, and I stood there, my phone still pressed to my ear, feeling like my entire world had just collapsed in an instant.